Now it is time for the final keynote, which I have been looking very much forward to as well. Our final speaker will reflect on how to find the right approach to AI for digital platforms and news media in the current geopolitical situation, and discuss whether a European model is not only possible, but also preferable. We're joined by Professor of Political Communication, University of Oxford, one of Europe's most respected voices on journalism and digital media. Please welcome Rasmus Kleis Nielsen.
Thank you for the opportunity to think aloud in front of you. I have to say that the moment we live in right now feels the most fraught and uncertain of a long period of fraught and uncertain developments in the media environment that I've researched most of my adult life. So this comes with the caveat, and Casper can confirm this, that while very flattered to be asked to speak today, I was unsure whether it was the right thing to do, because normally as a scientist I like to deal in reliable, discrete, concrete, specific statements, but I don't think we have that for the topic that I agreed with our amazing organizers that I would talk about today, which is European platform alternatives. And what I'll outline to you as 3 different possible models in search of your support. So the way I think about the sort of the moment we're in is, I think for those of us in the room, I think it's fair to say that most of us are we've seen the pictures of the sort of court of the Orange King. We have read the declarations, the servile declarations. We have maybe listened to the slightly cringe-inducing interviews with a disavowal of years of work and sudden changes of direction that happen to coincide with the emergence of new power in Washington, D.C. And in this moment, there is a resurgent insistence on the need for European alternatives, exclamation point. And there is conversation about digital autonomy, about technology sovereignty, and a range of issues that have been bubbling along in policy environments for a long time, in particular in France, in India, in some other parts of the world, but were sort of mostly for sort of nerds and wonks for a long period of time, but I think sort of exploded into at least a greater degree of elite interest and policymaker interest in Europe for very understandable reasons at this moment in time. I don't want to offer a sort of a prescription. It's generally not the way I think of my role as a scientist. But I'd like to offer you a set of sort of questions that I have that I think we can take with us as we think about what might these European alternatives look like if we were to pursue them, what would they involve, and what might we achieve. And on that basis, I trust each of you, and indeed every European citizen, to make up your own minds on the basis of your own ideals and your own interests, of whether you think that this is that any of these models, or all of them, are models that ought to be pursued. I think the way to think about where we are is to sort of think about this issue of Europe as in the European Union, with its sort of almost 500 million inhabitants, reliance on largely big, for-profit, US-American technology companies, as an issue of the sort of same scale and scope, complexity, and importance as some of the issues we face around, say, climate, defense, the future sustainability of the welfare systems that exist in some parts of the more privileged parts of Europe. And in that sense, this is a lot more complicated than ditching your Tesla and buying a Renault, right? I mean, this is a wicked problem. It's not a consumer choice, and whether at a government, a company, or an individual level. And I also think that this way of thinking about this as a big and wicked problem might be useful in just reminding us that each of us have a tiny little share of responsibility for where we are, right? Each of us as users, those of you who have advertising spends, Maybe those of you who work in publishers or other companies that act as complementers to platform companies in different ways. And of course, our governments, who are busy renewing large contracts with US American technology companies, even as some of the ministers responsible also give interviews to newspapers decrying the state of affairs that they are perpetuating. All of us have, to varying degrees, some responsibility for the position that we are in. We didn't sort of choose this reality, but the aggregate outcome of our choices as users, as advertisers, as complementers, including publishers and as government, have brought us where we are, as with climate and defense and welfare. So I think if we want to think about ways out of where we are, I think it's a good starting point to recognize that we have a set of wicked problems. But as with climate and defense and welfare, I hope we won't stop there and just wave the flag and talk about Europe. I think we need to push it a little further than that. So let me sketch 3 possible models for thinking about European platform alternatives to big for-profit American technology companies. Each of these models are trying to solve for a different analysis of what the problem actually is. The first model is one that solves for the perceived problem that these are American companies. And that solution essentially is what I would suggest we can think of as sort of the Airbus solution. So you have irritating Yankees who dominate an important, strategically important part of the economy in issues of national importance, political interest, public importance. And you respond to that through a mix of industrial policy, maybe some state support, maybe some strategic procurement practices, maybe some nudging of mergers and consolidation. If the national champions don't command a large enough national market, you begin thinking about this as a continental European Union level. You maybe try to create some collaborations, even over time merging these into even larger companies. You have to navigate the World Trade Organization. There might be a bit of sort of tit-to-tat with other governments about whether this is in fact state support, whether you're distorting trade and competition and whatnot. And what you have in the end, if you achieve this, if you succeed with this policy, is you have Boeing with a European Union passport. So you've solved the problem. If the problem was that the company in question was American, at least now you have a European alternative. And I have used this metaphor because it's a metaphor I'm confronted with all the time when I talk to people in Brussels. What we need are European Airbuses for the digital economy. But that's not the only way to think about where we are, right? There is a different line of thinking that is that the problem is not that they're American. The problem is that they're for-profit. And this calls then for a different type of solution, right? Because you have no reason to believe that Boeing with a European Union passport is necessarily going to be qualitatively different from Boeing on issues of value, of role, of practice, of performance, of ethics. So instead, what one would be looking at there would be what former Labour leader in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn, briefly floated as the idea of a BDC, a British Digital Corporation, as a counterpart to the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, as a publicly funded, arm's-length governed public service alternative to for-profit incumbents. And I think there, I really think we should recognize that Jeremy Corbyn had the courage of his convictions. He said the quiet part out loud. He talked about the scale and scope of what this would involve, right? Some of you work in public service media, and you will know that the scale and scope of investment that it takes to deliver the public service tradition that exists in many parts of Europe is very significant. Something like a quarter of what the commercial revenues are is what the public funding required to power public service media across Europe to achieve the market share and the roles that they play in our societies. Now imagine what that would take to do that for the digital economy, for each of the large US American technology companies that many of us are so reliant on. Think about the scale of funding that one would turn to citizens and ask them to provide. Think about the governance issues. At their best, public service media are genuinely independent of government and of parliamentary majorities, insulated from direct political pressures, protected by arm's length principles, independent boards, and the like. Of course, sadly, in much of Europe, this is not, in fact, the way that public service media operate, because they have very precarious funding, they have very direct forms of political or majoritarian governance, and in many cases, they are sadly really state broadcasters, not public service media, not necessarily through any fault of their own. And of course, it would involve actually dealing with the kind of sort of IT procurement challenges that the public sector historically, of course, has uniformly excelled at, where if one were to sort of really go toe-to-toe with the big incumbents. But I really think we should recognize that Corbyn at least sketched what this would entail if one were to solve for the problem of these being for-profit. So this is the second, the BDC possible model. And the question then, of course, becomes one of political and popular support. Again, those of you who work in public service media know that in much of Europe, there is very significant political pressure. There are private sector publishers who are not your biggest fans, and funding, while still comparatively generous in some countries, such as Denmark, where we are now, is often stagnant and being cut, as in the Netherlands and many other places. So this model is under tremendous pressure for legacy public service media, and what we're talking about is the creation of entirely new ones to compete with some of the most successful corporations in the world. But we could try. The third possible model is to think of the problem as being not that these companies are American, not that they're for-profit necessarily, but that they are big. That the problem here is a concentration of power in individual companies that sometimes in turn turn out to be beholden to who is in charge in the jurisdiction in which they are headquartered and where they make most of their money. If that's the way you think of the problem, then a possible solution is what we might think of as the Mastodon model. It's free, it's open source, it's decentralized. It provides an alternative approach to social media, and indeed to much more than that through the sort of wider distributed Fediverse. Now, of course, this alternative we don't need to create, right? This is not like Airbus or BDC, because this already exists. But perhaps here we are also inching towards the limitation of this if one really wants like-for-like alternatives to the large companies that we're talking about, because if we look at the citizen side of things, in last year's Reuters Institute Digital News Report, across the 40-some markets surveyed in that report, less than 1%, in fact 0.2% of respondents across the globe said that they had used Mastodon last week. That's less than 1/100th of how many said they had used X. So, you know, limited effective demand from the public. And not just from the public, right? So yesterday I looked through all the different publishers who have spoken at this event. I'm not going to name anyone in particular, but just to say, all but one of them are still on X. 5 of them have accounts on Mastodon, one of which turns out not to be an official account, but an automated RSS feed created by someone else. So this exists, but it's not really an alternative in the sense that I think people often meet. That doesn't mean that that last way of thinking about the problem is not potentially important right now and potentially also important as we move ahead. I mean, I think we should sort of say out loud and recognize that there are very important parts of the digital environment that are not big. Wikipedia, Signal, Blue Sky are examples. New Public, a civic tech nonprofit that I've been on the advisory board of for some time, are different examples of people who are trying to do different things with digital technology. But of course, these are also reminders that when we sort of sometimes slide into, frankly, rather crude anti-Americanism, that this is not necessarily about America, because a lot of these alternatives are, in fact, originating with civic tech and other circles in the United States of America. And again, it is seems to not generally be what is meant when people talk about alternatives, because what they are really talking about often are big alternatives. And again, judging from just the feeds that I have access to as an end user, again, I think this might resonate with this very crowd in this very room, right? Because at least impressionistically, this community is much less active on X than it was 2 or 3 years ago, but it is much more active on LinkedIn. So where have we moved? We have moved from a medium US American for-profit technology company to a much, much larger one. Not so much to Blue Sky, let alone Mastodon as a community. Why? Well, I think we can sort of give a name to that. What we return to here, I think, is one of the fundamental driving forces of where we have arrived at and where we might be heading with our media environments. We have to recognize that we make platforms powerful when they empower us to do things what we want to do, whether that is us as individual end users or the publishers that you all represent. And they often do that on the basis of leveraging economies of scale, network effects, and data network effects, and these accrue to the biggest players, right? So the reason that many of us, myself included, have, in the growing distaste for X, have migrated elsewhere, also to LinkedIn, is not that it's not American, it's not that it's not for-profit, it is that it is also big, and it also leverages economies of scale, network effects, and data network effects to help us do things we would like to do, which is reach other people with things we care about, and in some cases, make money off the back of it, whether as publishers or as loss leading. So small doesn't really deliver on this. So unless that changes and small becomes beautiful, it seems to be Airbus and or the BDC that are the alternatives, at least if one means big alternatives. And it's alternative in the plural, right? Because it's clearly not a single piece. When we think about where Europe and the European Union is in terms of the tech stack right now, it's quite a lot. It's chips, cables, it's compute, it's cloud and data centers, it's enterprise software, search, social, video, e-commerce with a few exceptions, advertising, foundational models. That's just 11 problems right there. If you think that reliance on US American technology companies is a existential threat for Europe. And for each of them, you have to answer at least 3 questions if you want to begin to address the wicked problem. What exactly should this alternative do? Which one of these at least 11 challenges is it meant to address? Just giving an interview to an Austrian newspaper talking about the need for a European super platform that combines elements of YouTube, Facebook, and Google search. Okay, fine, that's a start. But what exactly is this supposed to do? Secondly, where's the money going to come from? Who's going to fund it? It's not clear that private investors, individual consumers, or enterprise users on their own will fund it. It seems pretty clear that something else, at the very least, industrial policy and procurement, maybe public funding, depending on which of the 2 models you're looking at, is necessary in a substantial and sustained and uncertain way if one is to go toe-to-toe with any of these. And of course, third, how will it be governed? Who's going to make the rules and enforce the rules for these European alternatives? And right now, I would put to you that even as these discussions, I think justifiably, legitimately, rightly, even urgently, have intensified across Europe, it seems to me that with the partial exception of the group of people behind the sort of Euro tech stack sort of report and community, the answer to all these 3 basic questions is completely unclear, and perhaps even deliberately left unclear by a lot of the people who speak about these things, because these are very difficult questions to answer. And for each of them, again, I think it's fine to think out loud. I am thinking out loud right now. I don't have discrete, detailed, concrete responses to all of these questions. I don't know what the right thing is to do. But as with climate, defense, and security, I think we need to sort of pressure people in positions of responsibility to be a little bit more concrete than just saying it's going to be European and an alternative. Like, what is it exactly it's going to be? Who exactly is going to fund it? How exactly is it going to be governed? And I think we need to recognize that when it comes to the money side of things, we're talking about a lot of money, like really a lot of money. You may not have noticed, I apologize if you have, but you may not have noticed, so I will remind we are halfway through Europe's digital decade, for which the budget is 165 billion euros. You have noticed, haven't you? Right, so if that hasn't done the trick, you know, logically we would assume either that there are some people who are idiots. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's the problem. Maybe it's a bigger commitment of resources than that that we're talking about. And what is the context in which the temptation to be generous with other people's money is so pressing? It's a context in which, in the Eurozone as a whole, public debt stands at, I think, 87% of GDP. Public deficits well over 3.5% of GDP. Climate transition alone to the existing net zero commitments, according to the European Central Bank, would require at least 3 to 4 percentage points of GDP additional investment every year. Defense, to hit the new targets, 1 to 2 percentage points more of GDP. Welfare, solely through aging of European populations in the current anti-migration environment, 1 to 2 percentage points more GDP. So this is the context in which I am telling you that if we're looking at the big solutions, we're looking at very large sums of money. And we'll probably have to ask citizens for these money. That's the money side of it, if we assume we've decided the what is it going to do side of it, and we at least talked about the who's going to pay side of it. And then we're left with the how is it going to be governed part. I'm often told that they're going to be based on European values. That sounds good. I'm not opposed. But I do think that that is, again, is only raising a question. It's not providing an answer. What are these European values? Are they the ones that are enshrined in the Charter for Fundamental Rights? Are they the ones that are instantiated in existing legislation? Are they the ones that are expressed by current governments? Are they the values of Emmanuel Macron? Are they the values of Marine Le Pen? Are they the values of Jean-Luc Mélenchon? Are they the values of Friedrich Merz or of Alice Weidel, of Giorgia Meloni or Enrico Letta? I don't think we agree in Europe any more than the Americans do. And right now there is an ascendant force in America that got slightly more than half of the vote of those who voted. That has radically changed things in America. But I think we really need to remember that Europe is no more homogenous, no more consensual than America in these things. That 1 in 5 European Union citizens live in countries where Reporters Without Borders say that there are serious problems with media freedom, very often problems that originate with the state, with the government. And simply saying that these European alternatives will be based on European values does not in fact answer the question of what are these values and who defends them against encroachments, who gets to define them, and who gets to enforce them. One pair of Danish politicians who, again, I want to recognize for raising the discussion. It's important to have these discussions. We don't have to have fully formed answers to all these questions. But they said that in their view, probably, nice qualifier, I think it's good to qualify these things, probably content moderation on such a European alternative should be based strictly on legislation, on existing laws. That's a very clear statement. What they may not have thought of as they said it is that is actually exactly the position of Elon Musk, right? That in his view, then Twitter had gone above and beyond what was legally required in terms of content moderation and should be scaled back to only remove things that are illegal. Are those European values? Maybe. I don't know. But I think we need to have these conversations in terms of what they're going to do, where the money's going to come from, and how they're going to be governed. So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us where, just as we think of issues like climate, like defense, and like welfare, it's important to say that we want to at least discuss them and also address them. But it's not enough. And in particular, for people in positions of authority and responsibility, people who want to assume positions of authority and responsibility, whether that is in government or in the private sector, I think we want more than just a declaration. I think we want details. I think we want those details in terms of what they're actually proposing, and I think we particularly want those details if we are journalists or scientists and academics who want to understand, help citizens understand what the alternatives might look like, not as declarations and slogans, but as actually existing alternatives, not just rhetoric. And just as we think about each of these issues, I think again also for each of us as citizens and as users, yes, it is important to ask ourselves the question, do we want European alternatives? But I also think if we want to approach this in a serious fashion as individuals, I think we should ask ourselves this question, not in the sense of, do you want a house by the beach, or a house in the country or a long vacation, but in the sense of like, what do you want this more than? What are you willing to do? What are you willing to pay? What will you sacrifice for this alternative? That question, I think, is incumbent on each of us as individuals and our societies. I really want to stress that nothing I've said today is meant to be an endorsement of the status quo or in any way suggest resignation. Europe has done extraordinary things as a continent and individual member states, individual companies, including publishers, things that inspire across the world. It's been very, I think, rewarding to hear such recognition of the amazing work done around AI and journalism, for example, here in the Nordic countries, but not only in the Nordic countries, also from colleagues from the Anglophone world that tends to get a lot more attention. Europe has also done terrible things, let's leave that aside for a minute. And Europe can do extraordinary things again. This is a very privileged part of the world. It is rich. It is still, outside Ukraine, peaceful. Some parts of it are egalitarian and based on fundamental rights that are actually respected. And I don't think we should just resign ourselves to this being the best of all possible worlds. That's not at all the argument. The argument is simply this. This is important, and that's why we need to take it seriously. And that's what I've tried to do today. Thank you very much.